I'm delighted today to join you for this webinar event. I'm sorry that it is virtual and that I can't be there with you in person or even live, but as you're with me now, in real time, I'm in the Shannon speaking on the climate bill. So the timing of your event could not be any more in tune with what is happening in government and the policies that will shape the future of our country. I'd like to first recognise the importance of the Irish thoroughbred sector. It's a significant economic and cultural importance to Ireland, not only nationally, but internationally, as you all well know. As a breeder myself, I know what it is like to follow horses we've bred around the world as they race, and indeed to follow the progress of some of their progeny. And as you all know, the quality of our equine stock is renowned and envied worldwide. And my department recognises that success and supports the sector annually last year to the value of nearly 77 million euros. But we are here to talk about climate. And at the outset, I want to acknowledge how seriously you're taking the issue of climate action. And a serious issue it is too. This government is committed to addressing our climate problem and has committed to a climate reduction of 51% in emissions by 2030. This is not just a special figure for Ireland. We're not an outlier on this, as some would have you think. The EU as a whole has committed to a 55% in reduction by 2030. The United States is committed to 52% by 2030. And the UK has committed to a whopping great 78% by 2035. So these are all hugely ambitious targets, and we all need them. We all need to work together to achieve them, because we need to bring about the cooling effect that will save civilization on this planet of ours. I think it can be hard for some of us to think about climate action in isolation. And sometimes I think biodiversity action is a simpler, more tangible concept for us to consider. And it's equally important, perhaps even more so. Biodiversity in Ireland and in Europe is declining at never before seen rates. And actions that support biodiversity will often support climate action too. Indeed, many people might not think of the equine sector when we talk about agriculture's role in climate change mitigation. But this sector is really well placed to make a significant contribution to achieving our national emissions reductions targets and for improving on-farm biodiversity. And I congratulate the ITBA and the equine sector at large for taking this initiative. Indeed, I heard much about it when I visited you in the Irish National Stud just recently, when I met with John McEnery, Cathal Beale, David O'Connell and Shane O'Dwyer. I must say I really enjoyed the visit. I was very enthused to hear about the proposals and plans for reducing emissions on stud farms and for improving biodiversity. What struck me is the unique opportunity stud farms have to deliver for these important areas. I suppose typically stud farms aren't so dependent on inputs in the same way as, say, a dairy farm or an intensive beef farm might be. And with that, I feel comes the scope to deliver for climate action and biodiversity, and of course, water and air quality. All these hugely valuable public goods we need more and more of. You also accept that you're a significant player and rightly see yourselves as very environmentally conscious. But you also indicated to me you were aware of the dangers of complacency and that you need to be able to measure success in terms of emissions and biodiversity. One other point you raised was that you were doing it for the next generation. And I think that's really important and that we can all resonate that this is really what it is all about. I was certainly impressed by the ambition and the potential, and I think there's much scope for trials and pilot studies on stud farms in particular. And I'd be very interested actually to know the total land area covered on stud farms, large and small, of Ireland. That figure would be really useful for me to go back to my department and say we've X number of hectares all willing to play their part. One thing that also struck me, which I was really grateful for, was the interest you showed in soil. And to me, soil and soil health is fundamental to everything, be that potential in terms of carbon storage, but also as serving as the building blocks of biodiversity. Without healthy soil, we have nothing. And I'm not just talking about the P's and the K's and the nitrogen and the pH value. I'm talking about the life that lives in our soil. The life beneath our feet, the microbiology, the macrobiology, the fungi, everything that gives soil life. We know that the use of anthelmintics, for example, can damage that life, that soil biome. And besides concerns in relation to anthelmintic resistance, we will all do our land a great service by only treating animals that need to be treated. And this, of course, can be determined by simple fecal samples, which many veterinary practices will support. When I met you all when I met the group a month or so ago, you outlined the baseline study that you were doing, and I will be really interested to see the results of that work. I know you have funded this study yourself, and I think that really has to be commended. And I truly hope your findings will inform the development of future studies and other on-farm initiatives and schemes. My own department also recognises the importance of baseline measures. And my ministerial colleague, Charlie McConalogue, and I recently announced a number of initiatives aimed at getting baseline measurements of aspects like soil health, of biodiversity on farms. This work will be supported by the establishment of the National Agricultural Soil Carbon Observatory, which is also supported by my department. And this will measure greenhouse gas emissions from a range of different soil and farm types, and really places Ireland at the forefront of EU carbon sequestration research. To address further the absence of data on the sequestration taking place on Irish farms from hedgerows and trees, Teagasc has recently commenced a research project called Farm Carbon, Farm Hedgerows and Non-Forest Woodland Carbon. So I think we have significant potential for carbon sequestration in our soils, in our hedgerows, and in our trees. And we are really working hard to establish the research and the technological infrastructure which will inform us, which will measure these and inform us in the future, so we can reward farmers in their efforts to maintain and increase these sequestration activities. Earlier this year, I announced funding for on-farm biodiversity initiatives, which was really well received and was in fact well oversubscribed. Such is the interest among farmers and the wider community in working with farmers for biodiversity and climate action. Budget permitting, I hope to announce a similar scheme next year, and I'd love to see some stud farms involved in this, and maybe how land management with horses might be different to that with cattle or sheep. Let's explore the options here. My department also funds and has funded 23 larger scale projects under the European Innovation Partnership scheme. And these projects have worked with farmers and communities and ecologists and scientists to repair biodiversity, to create essential habitats for some endangered species, so species like the hen harrier, the freshwater pearl mussel, the corncrake, and indeed just creating habitats which will invite wildlife and nature onto our farms. And I think in this regard, the Irish National Stud has a significant role to play here. As a state body under the aegis of my department, I hope that the work you will do and the involvement you have in this, in the future of this, you will help change hearts and minds across the thoroughbred sector. I think one interesting example of that is the simplicity of allowing some of your land to grow wild. We all know how proud owners are of their stud farms, and sometimes we aspire to have everything looking perfect, neatly mowed verges, nice tight hedges, and not a weed in sight. But I think we all know at this stage that this is not the way nature is. Nature is wild, it can be tatty, and it's something that we all might really need to accept, is that sometimes leaving the weeds and leaving areas uncut is not showing that we don't care about our land. It's actually showing that we do, because we are willing to share with the very nature that allows us to exist. And that can be really empowering. I think this group, I think the ITBA and your members have the capacity to change the view of what is acceptable on our farms, to redefine what our stud farms look like and what they can deliver, apart from world-class racehorses, of course. And the public want us to do this, and the public would be behind us doing this. Finally, I'll make a brief mention of on-farm renewable energy, something that is gaining a lot of traction. My colleague, Senator Pauline O'Reilly, recently introduced a bill which will see non-domestic solar panels no longer requiring planning permission. And the upcoming launch of the Microgeneration Support Scheme by my other colleague, Minister Eamon Ryan, will also provide the incentives for farmers to become producers of renewable energy, not only for themselves, but that they will be entitled to receive a fair price for excess electricity, which they export back into the national grid. I think challenges we face in combating climate change and biodiversity are clear. And our stud farms have a massive role to play here. I hope you're looking forward to the panelists later on. There's an excellent lineup ahead. Professor John Sweeney is no stranger to those who have been working in the area of climate change in Ireland, and I've no doubt he will pull no punches when he speaks with you later. Of particular interest to myself and my role within my department will be Professor Jim McAdam and his insights into the role that agroforestry can play in achieving not only our climate change targets, but also the contribution this land use option can provide to our biodiversity. John Geraghty is an expert in soil management, and I've heard him talk on a couple of occasions with passion about the soil and about sustainable agri-environmental practices. And David O'Connell will discuss aspects in relation to soil and grass management, and his expertise in aspects such as mineral deficiencies and imbalances should make for a fascinating discussion. So without further ado, I'll pass you back to Cathal. I hope you all enjoy the webinar and that by the end of it, you'll have a newfound passion for your farms.
So, if we can begin with Emeritus Professor John Sweeney on the topic of climate change, cause and effect.
Thank you very much, Cathal, and thanks for inviting me to talk to you this morning. I hope you can see my screen at this stage. Great, lovely. Okay, well, I mean, I think my job today is really to talk a little more about the nature of climate change and the impacts of climate change. And you have three really good speakers following me on some of the practical aspects, especially of relevance to the ITBA. So I'll kick off. Basically, I think, you know, we know that there's a big problem here, but in the past couple of years, we've been obsessed with the other problem, the problem of COVID, of course. And I just wanted to show you this latest histogram, if you like, of where things are. We know that we've now reached a total of over 3.8 million deaths from COVID. And we've been listening very carefully to what the health people have been telling us, the World Health Organization and so on. But I wanted to show you this because we also know that the World Health Organization has been issuing comments as well on climate change. And one of these is there before you now, which indicates that the WHO believe that between 2030 and 2050, about 250,000 people will die each year, directly and indirectly, from the effects of climate change. So that's much greater than even the COVID total that I showed you a moment ago. And it reminds us, of course, that we have other problems as well, even when we solve COVID, that we have to tackle. From the map there, you can see, of course, where the bulk of those deaths are going to occur. They're going to be in the developing world, and they're going to be in parts of the world which have not really contributed much to the problem of climate change that we're going to address this morning. So just to bear in mind that we have these things in the background which we mustn't forget about and which may actually be a bigger problem even than COVID itself. Now, you know the problem. This is a rather hackneyed old animation at this stage, which shows how the world has warmed over the past century or so. You can see, I show you it for a couple of reasons. Firstly, to remind us that when we talk about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees of warming, that's a global average. And many parts of the world will warm to a greater extent than that. And you can see those parts of the world here. Generally, the interiors of the continents, where a lot of people live, and parts of the Arctic and Antarctic, where there are climatic consequences I'll come to later on. So when we talk about that average of 1.5 or 2 degrees, we must remember that it may reflect, in fact, in terms of 3, 4, 5 degrees in some parts of the world. Secondly, of course, to remind us that that warming has now reached a point at which we've reached the warmest years on record since thermometers became reliable in the early 19th century. So we have that issue to think about. Kerry asked me just to make a couple of slides on what the nature of the greenhouse and global warming effect is. And it's a very simple thing really to understand, because we're looking at something which arises from the effects of what we put into the atmosphere. And we know that sunlight and visible light can penetrate right through the atmosphere. It's very, very clear for that shortwave radiation to reach the surface and warm the Earth. And then normally that warmed Earth would then lose that heat and radiate it back out to space as long wave radiation. However, along the way there are gases which in the atmosphere trap some of that outgoing long wave radiation. They don't trap it coming in, but they trap it going out. And this is what warms up the Earth. This is what gives rise to what we call the greenhouse effect, the trapping of heat at lower levels. It's a very easy concept, I think, for many of you who deal with horses to understand. You know, you put a blanket on a horse to keep the heat of the horse in, to stop the heat escaping to the outside. And in a way, what we do to the atmosphere is the same. It's putting greenhouses in to stop that heat escaping to the surface. In this case, of course, in the case of the horse, it's intentional. In our case, it's unintentional. And those gases we know are mainly carbon dioxide, also methane, CH4, and nitrous oxides. And we know the sources of those. They're coming from the burning of fossil fuels. In the case of CO2, they're coming from the denitrification of fertilizers a lot in the case of nitrous oxide, and they're coming from gases emitted by animals in the case of methane. So, you know, where you're looking at producers here, you can make a guess at what this cow is saying. But what I wanted to emphasize here for your particular purposes is that the horse is not a producer of methane to any extent, to the same extent as a cow, especially a dairy cow. An average horse produces about 20 kilograms of methane and 9 tons of manure a year. That's only 1/6 of the methane that a typical cow would produce. So as was mentioned at the very beginning by Shane, the breeding of horses is not necessarily anything like as intensive as the construction and operation of a dairy farm. And the figures here are quite stark. And I mention them to you because later down the road this year, there will be quotas, there will be carbon budgets established for agriculture. And I think it's very important that your particularly, I suppose, more environmentally benign form of agriculture should be in there negotiating on that basis, rather than being excluded with the big guys in intensive agriculture crowding you out to some extent. So that comes about, of course, because horses don't eat rough grasses. You probably are well aware that they are very selective in what they eat. And that's because the horse only has one stomach, unlike a cow. So it can only deal with very easily digestible grasses. They're very selective grazers, in other words. And therefore, they don't produce as much methane in their digestive system to the same extent as other forms of agriculture. How do we know what's been happening to the atmosphere? Well, we can obviously measure in recent times what the concentration of these greenhouse gases has been. Here in Macehead in County Galway, for example, we can measure it continuously. If we want to go further back into the past, then we have to find ways of finding what the air was like thousands of years ago. And there have been some very inventive ways of doing that, putting a probe into the pyramids, for example, which is on climate change. So you can see that we, although we can't see our problem, we are actually very considerable contributors to the whole thing. And we know as well that most of those balloons, if you like, most of those emissions are coming from the big industrialized countries of North America, of Western Europe, of Japan, China, South Korea. And also we can see how little comes from the developing world, where they are going to face the biggest problems, if you like, of impacts. Unless you think that we up here are so insignificant, we don't need to worry about that. Well, let me assure you that we produce here in Ireland, I shouldn't say Germany there, ignore it. We produce more than the 400 million poorest people on the planet in terms of greenhouse gases. So it's quite a sobering thought. And of course, the modeling that has been done for the IPCC suggests that that warming that we looked at will continue. On the present track, it may well reach 4 degrees by the end of this century. And again, focusing on those areas that we looked at before in the interiors of continents. We don't have the same certainty about what's going to happen for rainfall, but in general, what we can say is the places that don't get enough rain will get less, and the places that get too much rain will probably get more. And that creates 3 key vulnerable areas right away. It creates the areas, firstly, of sub-Saharan Africa, where, of course, we know how quickly societies can destabilize if the reliable amounts of rain don't appear. It creates problems in the low-lying coral areas, the areas very close to sea level, where hundreds of thousands of people live, 1 or 2 meters above sea level, in the Indian and in the Pacific Ocean. And it creates problems in the great deltas of the world, where the land is already subsiding due to the weight of sediment being brought down in many cases. And it raises issues of climate justice, which I'm sure you've heard about, because these are the peoples who have not caused the problem in the first place. In the case of the deltas, of course, if you were to look at Bangladesh here, those red areas are around about 5 meters above sea level. And you can see how much of the country that corresponds to, maybe an area the size of Ireland. But of course, we have about 6 million people in this island. Here, we're looking at 160 million people potentially at risk of displacement from that. And even a 1 meter rise in sea level, you can see how much of that country will effectively be gone. And that creates issues of people displacement, which will make the Mediterranean look very, very tame indeed in the years to come. So we know that warming has now brought us to the point where we had last year the warmest year on record for Europe, globally the joint warmest year ever measured. We know that we've seen some of the extreme events that may well be associated with that warming, the fires, the loss of forestry, the way in which we're damaging some of the most valuable ecosystems on the planet. And I wanted to show you this modeling output for the Middle East, because I know many of you may have contacts in the Middle East. And this is just what we expect to see happening, in the next few decades, probably by the 2070s, 2080s. And what I want to show you here is on the present trajectory, you're looking at places in the Middle East where the mean maximum daily average temperature will be well over 50 degrees centigrade. Now that means that you can't really adapt to that kind of temperature outdoors. It's going to create problems of sustainability in many parts of the world. And we have to recognize that some parts of the world may well become uninhabitable as a consequence. The other aspect just to mention, of course, is that we now are increasingly concerned with what we call tipping points, where we know that at certain temperatures, maybe 1.5 to 2 degrees here, we may start the irrevocable melting out of major ice sheets. We may have lost the coral reefs within the next few decades. We will probably have lost many of the alpine glaciers within the next few decades. And we're seeing these changes, tipping points, which we may not recover from, even if we get our act together, with other more potentially serious ones down the road as well. So we've made some progress. We've made some progress in the last year, which hasn't been publicized, but will be publicized later this year with the publication of the next IPCC report. But what we now recognize is that you know, the importance of the loss of Arctic sea ice here. And this is the current trajectory of Arctic sea ice. You could sail from Ireland, for example, and I think one of our speakers may well be out in the Atlantic somewhere at the moment, but you could sail from Ireland all the way around to China and to Japan last September without seeing any ice. You could sail all the way through the fabled Northwest Passage through to southern Alaska, California, and the west coast of the United States without really encountering many obstacles. This is unheard of, and even as we speak at the moment, our sea ice is declining along the lines of the most extreme year thus far, 2012. So we're seeing that change. And why is that important? It's important because the warming of the Arctic is what really destabilizes the jet stream. And there's a lot of research that's suggesting now that the jet stream becomes more wobbly as the difference between the equator and the Arctic decreases, rather like a river that's lost its gradient. And that's what gives us some of these extreme events that we've had in the past few years in Europe and North America. 2018, record warmth all the way to the North Pole, which was above freezing. And then that cold winter we had in Europe. Whereas in 2019, we had the opposite, the jet stream wobbling all the way south and then rising over Europe, giving us a warm, abnormal winter in 2019. These are the kind of things that we now increasingly can attribute to the kind of changes we're making in the Arctic. And secondly, then, we now can answer the question which throughout my career bedeviled me, because every time there was an extreme event, the press would phone and say, is this climate change? And the answer was always, no, you can't be certain. It may have happened before. It may be the kind of thing we'd expect to see more frequently, but now we can run our models much more frequently and run them with no CO2, with low CO2 and with high CO2, and say, well, how much more likely is an event like a heat wave in France here in 2019? How much more likely was that to occur if we hadn't messed up the atmosphere? And we can get figures of maybe 10 times more likely, and so on. And that gives a very powerful policy instrument to decision makers. The big event last year was the warming of the Arctic and Siberia here. This is Verkhoyansk, and Verkhoyansk is the most northerly populated on a permanent basis town in the world, where the average temperatures in January are minus 50 degrees centigrade, minus 50 degrees centigrade. A short summer like Ireland, maybe for a couple of months. But last year, Verkhoyansk hit 38 degrees centigrade and stayed there for a long time. Very exceptional indeed. And using that model without mentality, or approach rather, methodology, we know that that was an event which was maybe 600 times more likely to have occurred with climate change. So we can now debunk the skeptics very largely on these bases. And of course, that opening up of the Arctic has now resulted in a new trade route becoming well established across the northern part of Russia. Something like 450 voyages took place this last summer on that particular route. Sensitive environment, an oil spill would be catastrophic. Issues of sovereignty, issues of all kinds of contestation going to come out. Now, for Ireland, we're not immune from climate change. We've warmed ourselves here by 0.65 degrees in the past 30 years over the previous 30 years. We're very much following the global mean average, as you might expect from a country in the mid-latitudes. And we know from the modelling that we've been doing in Maynooth that that's likely to continue with another ½ degree at least in the next 30 to 40 years. But our main problem in Ireland is likely to be rainfall, with having too much of it in the west here in winter and having too little of it in the summer in the east here. And that's going to create problems of flood problems in the west, and also problems of drought and problems of water supply, where most of our cities and many of our population centers are located. It will threaten our habitats. Bogs are not going to like dry summers. Salt marshes are not going to like sea level rises. The Mac Air of Connemara, very sensitive, not likely to like the sea level rise either. And many of our species, which we would like to move uphill or would like to move uphill, will find that they reach the top of their thresholds of viability at some stage. So we're going to face issues in terms of vulnerable species. We know, as the Minister was talking about, some of the sensitive species. We know that the curlew is nearly gone. There's only 160 breeding pairs left in Ireland. We know that there are other species like Arctic char and there are upland corries, which are going to be find it very difficult in warmer waters, and many other species which may face problems. I wanted to show you one which I've been looking at over the past few years, because it's not a species we're going to lose, but one we're going to gain. And this is unfortunately one of those pests. And this is what we call the horse chestnut leaf miner. And it's a moth. And I show you it because at this time of the year, the chestnut trees are all in bloom, but the horse chestnut leaf miner does this to the leaves, and it destroys the leaves and the foliage very effectively. And the leaves will start falling of some chestnut trees this coming month. Where did it come from? It came here from Macedonia in 1981. That was where it was first discovered. And over the period, it has managed to migrate all the way across Europe, making its way across England, arriving in Ireland a few years back. And this is some trees I took a photograph of a few years back on the edge of the Phoenix Park. And this is what will happen. So have a look at your chestnut trees if you have them on your farms this year and see whether you're getting the problem arriving. Because I think at the moment it's moving west in Ireland from the East Coast. Tackling the problem, Paris, tackling the problem, an agreement which we thought was going to provide the answers, an agreement which followed the IPCC rule, if you like, that we had to reduce our emissions to net zero by 2050. And that's been the, if you like, the touchstone of most of the national policies we've seen. I have to tell you, Paris is failing. Paris is not working. And it's not working because countries are generally playing their national self-interest card too much. And they're conditionally pledging reductions in emissions. And I'll just show you three here. Jordan saying, yes, we will reduce our emissions by 14%, but if we don't get the money, 1.5. Palestine, yes, we will reduce our emissions by 24.4, but if we don't get independence, 12.8. And Israel, yes, we will reduce our emissions on a per capita basis by 26%. But what they don't say is if the population increase is as expected, that will result in an increase in emissions. So there's a lot of wheeling and dealing going on behind the scenes here. And it's simply we don't have time for that because we only have about a decade left in terms of burn if we want to avoid 1.5, and maybe a couple of decades left if we want to avoid 2 degrees of warming. And that is, when I say avoid, I mean that is the burn that we have for the next several hundred years if we want to avoid that. It's not something we will get back from. So a lot of, as the Minister said, a lot of political and legislative programs emerging. We've seen the climate bill for the last few months being debated in the Dáil. We've seen how it's based on a carbon budget, which will reduce emissions by 51% by 2030. And this would be the kind of glide path one would expect to see the government following to meet that. But however, politicians being politicians, there's always a tendency to kick for touch to the next government and to make things easy for the first few years and then leave the next government to pick up the pieces. And that's what I think we have to watch very carefully when the carbon budgets are established later on this summer. Last few points I want to make here is, first of all, the movement for divestment is now huge. Countries and indeed foundations, faith groups, governments are now pouring money out of investments in fossil fuels. Ireland actually was one of the first to do that, but it's now reached a very large scale of about 5 trillion of divestment. Ireland was the first country to divest its sovereign wealth fund from fossil fuels. But when you see the Rockefellers doing it, you know that something really is happening there. And of course, we have the youth of the world really active on this point. We know the kind of influence they're having on politicians, the way they can mobilize, and the way they can cut through a lot of the fog, if you like, of bureaucracy and legislation. But I want to finish, and I know I'm over time, I want to finish by just showing you 2 slides, and this is from Iceland. And this shows the first glacier in Iceland to lose its status as a glacier. This is what it looked like in 1986. This is what it looked like a couple of years ago, just a little crater left with some snow in the middle of it. And what do you do when something dies? Well, you put up a headstone. And here's the Prime Minister putting up a headstone to the loss of the first glacier in Iceland. And it says, and the key message is here, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. And what they're putting on the headstone is very telling for me to finish on. This monument is to acknowledge that 1, we know what's happening. 2, we know what needs to be done. And 3, and this is the message for your grandchildren, only you know if we did it. So we have, if you like, encapsulated the problem of intergenerational equity. It's a problem that we have to solve now, because if we don't, our grandchildren will not be able to tackle it. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Our sincere thanks to John for an excellent global overview, I think, of just the scale of the global crisis and I think the science behind it. If you have comments, questions, post it in the chat box and we'll tackle them all at the end when the speakers have finished. If we can ask John to stop sharing and Jim to start sharing. Our next speaker will be Professor Jim McAdam on the topic of agroforestry, a climate resilient land use option. So we'll hand over to Jim when if he can start sharing his screen. John, if you can stop sharing your one, we'll get that up and running.
Morning, everyone, and apologies for the slight delay. It's a pleasure to be speaking to the group. It's not a group I have a lot of dealings with in the past with the equine sector. So it is a real pleasure to be actually talking to you about agroforestry. And if anything, from John's really salutary talk there, we really see we have to do something. We must do something to try and make, from our perspective, our farming systems more climate resilient, and to try and introduce to the way we use land a more climate resilient agriculture. So what I'm really going to talk today is about agroforestry, and I think it's very appropriate and pertinent that we do, because really over the last 12 months, there's been a real awakening of interest in agroforestry, particularly in Ireland. And that's led us, a group of us who are working in agroforestry, to form really at a fledgling state, the Irish Agroforestry Forum. And I'll mention that at the end, the sort of message we're trying to pull together. I'm not saying that agroforestry, that we cover the whole country in agroforestry, but what I want to say is that agroforestry is one land use option that landowners could introduce into their farms, and how that can be used at key times in the year to help deliver a more climate resilient grassland option. I'm going to talk about, just very briefly, about challenges, and then concentrate on what do we actually mean by agroforestry, and what can silvopasture, which is just a form of agroforestry, offer on this island. And I'll base that on the research base, the evidence base for that, from research that we've done, particularly in Northern Ireland over the last 30 years or so. Then how might that research be translated into taking agroforestry forward as a viable land use option, and the future prospects and direction we might have. I don't think I have to spend long going over the current issues facing farming and forestry in Ireland, as John has outlined quite a few of those. And from a sustainability perspective, Irish agriculture really faces challenge in all those range of areas there: water quality, biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions. And from those are tree cover and planting targets, the measures we've put in place that we're struggling to find and to meet. The Minister highlighted the importance of soil health and degradation, which I was very pleased she did, and how, following that, we need to have climate change mitigation obligations. We need to meet those. And at the same time, we have to ensure family farm viability, and we have to ensure that access to markets maintains, because it's very important. Land management is key, really, in relation to the agriculture and land use sector. It's really important we keep people on the land, we keep people managing pastures, grassland, trees, forestry, so that they can deliver these options. And what I really want to illustrate in terms of agroforestry is that, in my feeling, trees can be part of this solution. We need to get more trees into our landscape, maybe move outside the conventional thinking box of just planting forests of introduced exotic conifers, or of making land simply desolate and rewilding from agriculture. We need to think about how we bring trees in the wider perspective. And agroforestry is one potential tool in our armory to help deliver these climate change objectives. It's really just a collective name for land use practice where trees are combined with crops and or animals. And this is the key. It's on the same unit of land. I mean, we could have a square field with trees all around it, and that's useful and it's valuable. But you're not getting the ecological and economic interactions that actually having the tree and the agricultural component intimately linked together. That delivers the biology, it delivers the shelter, and it delivers some of the things I'm going to talk about shortly. Agroforestry is a worldwide land use practice. If you think of countries where they grow crops under bananas for shade, they grow pineapples under coconut trees for shade. All of these are situations where trees and agriculture are combined in some way or other. But in Ireland, as most of our agriculture is essentially grass dominated, we're really looking at a type of agroforestry, which the word silvopasture has been used, silvo trees on grass, silvopasture. And that's where we're growing trees in a grazed pasture in a regular or varied pattern, or cut pasture, if you like. So just to sort of illustrate that, if we think of ecosystems and we think of stability, one of the key messages we know from basic ecology is that complexity equals stability. And if we have a simple grazing system here, like our animal grazing, that's a fairly simple system. The animal is eating the grass, it's returning dung and nutrients, and it's so on. And you maybe have one species or 2 or 3 species of grass, and you have a limited range of flora and fauna. And we know that if something comes in to affect that, whether it's a drought or a pest or something like that, that system will require energy to be put in to maintain its stability. And it's that energy in the form of fertilizer or agrochemicals that are the problem. But if we introduce something like, say, a tree into that system, we bring in a level of complexity which makes that system much more stable. It means it's delivering a much wider range of ecosystem services, which I talk about. For example, if there was excess fertilizer put onto those fields, or a slurry dose followed by heavy rainfall, and a lot of the nutrients escaped below the grassroot level, we now have good evidence that those nutrients will be picked up by the tree roots, recycled through the trees, and held there. And they won't end up in the water, causing water pollution. And we know, of course, that we know all the benefits of trees in improving biodiversity and storing carbon. And these are the messages that I'll just talk about now. These are just a few examples. I mean, agroforestry is a new land use practice in Ireland, really, but these are just a few examples of things that are actually going on at the minute. There are people out there who are trying to explore this idea of agroforestry, and that, as I say, recently we've got together as a forum to try and bring that expertise together to help people who are interested in agroforestry. Agroforestry can come in a wide range of forms. The top there, you have belted Galloway cows in County Cavan under trees on the Shackleton farm. You have a farmer here, Liam Beechiner, in near Clonakilty, who has planted rows of trees. He's cutting silage. This was in when they started. Now this is a couple of years ago what the site looks like. He's cutting silage between the trees, then he grazes. A farmer in County Leitrim grazing cattle in his hazel orchard. Poultry systems are silvopasture. We know that hens produce ammonia, and we know that hens are a bird that likes shade and shelter, and free-range poultry systems lend themselves very much to that. Pig systems, sheep orchards. A lot of orchards the grass is going to waste, it's unused, but these are ideal for introducing an agriculture and a crop component. Silvo-arable systems, this is just a picture from one of our trial sites at Loughgall in County Armagh, where we grew wide-spaced poplar trees and grew a cereal crop between those. Tillage is not a big area in Ireland. It could be more, and I think it should be more. But in areas of England, there's been a lot of development work done on these silvo-arable systems, which mean that you can reduce agrochemical input and you can mitigate the wind passage over the crop and things like this. And our own, the one I talk most about is sheep and ash trees there in our silvopasture in the bottom right. Horses, of course, and I admit right away, I'm not an expert in grazing horses, and there is a dearth really of scientific information on horses in silvopastoral system, but the basic principles apply, that when you grow trees in pasture and grassland, you improve the biology of the soil and you create a product where it's an understory pasture which is utilized by the animal in one way or another, and horses graze one way and other animals graze another. And also you're also delivering a landscape which is storing more carbon and is much more water friendly. These are just a few other examples locally of down the bottom right there in Wexford, establishing rows of trees behind electric fence there in the middle of cattle grazing system, and some cattle grazing in silvopasture in some of our own sites up in Loughgall. Silvopasture can also be established from a more mature forest. In the bottom left there, you have a larch plantation that has been thinned out and grass seed sown and the seed tramped in by sheep. And you now have a completely different landscape, if you like, where you're actually storing carbon and delivering the benefits of having trees in those. We just go back really 30 years ago. Why did we start, if you like, our agroforestry program and to come up with the evidence that we have? It really, our driver was not climate change in 1989 whenever we started this work. Really, our driver was to make grasslands in Northern Ireland then more sustainable, because we were just still in the middle of a period of very intensive fertilizer use. We were in the middle of a period where we had big problems with loss of biodiversity and loss of heterogeneity in our grasslands. We had problems with water quality, and there was a real need to try and get trees into the farmed landscape. We have the lowest tree cover in Europe. We still, excluding Iceland, where we have only 7% officially of tree cover. So small farms, small family-run farms are reluctant to take land out of agriculture and put it directly into forestry. So a group of us across the UK looked at options where we might try to get trees into the farmed landscape in a different way. And we looked particularly at the New Zealand model, where they had introduced mainly Pinus radiata to try and control soil erosion in South New Zealand and both parts of New Zealand. And they established these at wide spacing and grazed sheep between them. So we set about trying to replicate that research, or if you like, modify it to suit conditions on the British Isles. And we set up a major trial across 6 sites where we looked at 3 different systems. One was just straight pasture on the left with perennial ryegrass. The other, well, we took a large uniform area, subdivided into 1 hectare plots, and then had 3 replicates of each treatment of pasture with perennial ryegrass. In silvopasture, where we planted trees at wide spacing, that is 5 meters apart, 400 trees per hectare. We also had a 100 trees per hectare spacing, but that didn't work well, which I can talk about later. And as our third treatment, we had conventional woodland planted with ash, because ash was the tree then which we saw as having great potential in Ireland. We know now, of course, that obviously the problems with ash are ahead of us, but at least our site enabled us to demonstrate the principles of silvopasture. So in 1989, we planted the trees. From the day and hour the trees were planted, we had livestock in with those trees, and we were able to follow right through the history of the site, all of the ecological interactions, the outputs, the tree growth, the sheep performance, and the pasture performance in that site as the trees developed. And we learned a lot from it. I should say right away that none of us, in the early days of this research, none of us were foresters. most of us were grassland scientists. My background was agronomy. And we were really trying to sell a grassland system, not a way of producing trees. Foresters largely shied away from silvopasture because they said it's not the way to produce tall, straight trees for the timber market. We were really trying to sell a grazing system to make it more biodiverse and to make it more sustainable. And so we were trying to target sheep or a grassland farming market. So our aim was to prove that we could actually establish this system and that it could work on farms. Farmers could manage grassland the way they had always done, and yet at the same time deliver these ecosystem services that having trees were. So there's just a sequence of photographs through the age of the plots. And the first thing was we could successfully do that. We were able to grow wide space trees, and there's not much experience really of growing trees at that spacing, what happens to them, how they affect the soil, and how they affect the livestock in between. So that was, the trees grew well, and they weren't affected by any of the farm practices that we put on them. And the farmer in our site, and in our case, was able to adapt and look wider. When we got to about year 12 years, that was about 2001 or two, we were faced with a challenge, because that was the first time that the trees started to reduce the pasture yield and the output of sheep. Now, first of all, that was a surprise, because all the computer models said that you're going to start to get pasture reduction after the trees are about 6 or 7 year old. That was based just on modeling, and yet we proved, and because this was done over 6 sites in the UK and 3 replicates on each site, the scientific veracity of the whole work is very good. But when we reached about 12 years, we had to make a decision. Should we either start thinning some of these trees and let light back in and let the pasture grow, or should we just go for a denser tree cover and get the benefits from the trees? And nearly all the farmers who we've brought to see this system over the years, this is the one thing they like about it. They like flexibility, because if a farmer commits their land to planting trees, to planting a forest or a woodland, that's it pretty well tied up for 50, 60, 70, 80 years, whatever the rotation cycle is. Whereas farmers saw this as an option where they could have a choice. When they got to say 12 years, they could make a decision. They could look at the markets and they could say, right, there's a huge future for grass and meat production, so we'll gradually thin our trees. Or they could say, I think there's a huge future for timber or carbon, and we'll let the trees develop. So, well, we decided to thin, and we took 1/4 of the trees out. Those were ash, and all along we had an interest shown from the Guild of Hurley Makers in Ireland, and they came and some of them bought the trees, and we got an income then of about €1,000 per hectare from that first thinning, because the quality of the trees was good. And we've done 2 subsequent thinnings since, and sold the trees out of that. So that we're now standing at a tree density of about 200 trees per hectare, and we'll probably do another tree thinning as we go. And at that time, we're still maintaining an agricultural balance and tree development. So that's really the type of what we have at the minute. Almost, we have pasture under that. That from the point of view of the basic payment, a single farm payment, the department regards that as forage area, not as forest area. So the farmer is getting the benefit of an accumulated crop at the same time as a viable forage resource. Then come, by sort of the mid 2000s or the 2010-ish, the whole concept of sort of ecosystem services that we get from farmland started to come into play. And we looked really a bit wider at what was this silvopasture system delivering. It wasn't just delivering meat or a crop or wool or a sellable output like timber, but it was actually delivering a whole other range of things. It was delivering pollinators if you had the right trees in. It was delivering renewable energy if you wanted to coppice some trees. It was delivering flood control, and I'll show evidence for that. And beneath the ground, there was a healthy soil, there was carbon storage, and there was cleaner water emerging. So we had the evidence base over time for all of these. So this idea of having a system that was sustainable and delivered in ecosystem services sort of came into being. And because we had the evidence from our trial, we had monitored all of these things over the history of it, we were able to demonstrate that silvopastoral systems were able to deliver this range of ecosystem services. In Northern Ireland, our key problem, this is phosphate index of soil. The red is phosphate index of 3 and above. And so we have a huge chunk of farmland in the middle of the country where high levels of phosphate are a problem. How do you remove that phosphate? It takes 30 years to remove phosphate from grassland if you just stop applying. But if you plant trees in that, the trees remove the phosphorus from deeper in the soil and they help produce a healthier soil. Ammonia emissions are a big problem, and these are both problems in the Republic as well. And we now know that trees capture ammonia, and more importantly, they help extend the length of the grazing season. You can keep animals out of houses when ammonia is being produced. We looked at, because we're part of Queen's University as well, we are sort of, ITBA is the equivalent roughly Teagasc in the south, and we don't have the education function. And we have this link between a university site and also a government research institute, which means that we can bring PhD and master's students onto the site. So over the years, we've been able to have a whole range of studies done on all detailed aspects of these ecosystem services. For example, biodiversity. If you've looked, this is whenever the site were about 8 or 9 years old. The middle bar there is the agroforestry. This is the grassland plots, and these are the woodland plots. And you can see that for spiders, birds, beetles, we were getting higher levels of biodiversity, pollinators, flora, and very importantly, earthworms. One thing, we picked up high densities of particularly young and earthworms in the agroforestry. So we had the good evidence base there. Within the last 8 or 9 years, soil carbon has increasingly become a factor that is, that we're really interested in. And we were able, because we had this site that was, its integrity is preserved, we've maintained the integrity of the replicated system. And it's actually now the longest running silvopastoral trial in Europe. So we are sort of widely sought of to participate in various programs. We did a few years ago, we had a detailed look at where the soil carbon was in the silvopasture down through the profile and in the different systems. And we found that there was more, although the actual total amount of carbon stored in silvopasture was not much different from the other systems, much more of that carbon was bound onto microparticles in the soil. And that carbon is much more recalcitrant and less able to be lost and oxidized as carbon dioxide. So that's we call that sort of long-term carbon, and these silvopastoral systems have good stores of that long-term carbon. From that, we've calculated that from typical pasture, we're storing maybe 0.6, 0.7 tons carbon per hectare per year. From our silvopasture, we're actually getting about 2.4 tons. That was our estimate. So, and trees have a huge potential to store soil organic carbon on agricultural land and agroforestry systems. The other benefit we have found is very important in terms of what happens to rainfall. As John said, we're going to get much more intensive floods of rain. Rain is going to come in bigger bursts. And we found very much that our silvopastoral plots, the water was just percolating away from those much quicker and much better than where there were no trees. And the big thing that meant was that we were able to extend the length of the grazing season. And over time, we've measured a 13 to 17 week extension in the length of the grazing season. And that effect on the porosity of the soil has gone right down to about 76 centimeters. I think there's significantly more soil porosity than there is just where you have grazing alone. Very important. And that means, as I say, the soil is just drier over the winter, and we can extend the length of the time animals can be kept out. And that is the best way to reduce ammonia emissions. Ammonia is produced whenever slurry is produced by animals in houses. If you keep animals out, you only produce 6% of the ammonia. And we found our plots during the droughts of the last few years, the spring and summer droughts, have maintained more grass on the agroforestry than in the open pasture. And that, I believe, is because of reduction in evapotranspiration under the trees. There's a lot of evidence worldwide for the benefits agroforestry brings to soil health. Soil physical nutrition is improved, and so on, and all those benefits that mix. You can play around with the under tree fodder. You can vary your sward with multi-species. You can deliver much more nutritious pasture. And trees can be introduced to farming in a whole range of scenarios. Hedgerows are important. They store large quantities of stored carbon. And I was particularly pleased that the Minister mentioned the importance of measuring and the metrics that we have around how trees store carbon. We don't have a good handle on that in Ireland. I suspect we're storing far more CO2 and sequestering more in our hedges and trees than in our soils than we're actually being given the credit for. There's very little research has been carried out in equine agroforestry systems. Horses are not ruminants, as John pointed out. And he said overall he gave a figure of about a sixth, which is true, but there's one paper which I looked at which compared that sort of a lactating dairy cow with a lactating mare of the same size, and the mare was producing about only a third of the methane. So all of these are important factors when you look at agroforestry. So horses, equine systems in agroforestry, perfectly feasible, I think. We know, I just asked one of my equine colleagues who's also an expert in agroforestry, and she's told me about how horses' digestion is very important. But a lot of ponies and horses, native horses, are used, can graze very rough pasture and can convert that. And horses are very useful for conservation grazing, as we know, as well as the other issues there are. So there are huge benefits in having trees on farms. Just finally, how can we promote silvopasture? First of all, I think it needs to be a two-pronged attack as a tree production system, because we can produce high-value trees if you manage those well, and those can produce income and they can produce all sorts of other outputs. But as I've shown more, maybe as a grassland system, to produce nutritious, wholesome food or to graze valuable animals, and where farms can be made more sustainable and carbon friendly. Just quickly, in terms of government support, there is an agroforestry measure in the south. It is under the forestry legislation, if you like. If you look at the establishment premia and the money it's involved, much better than we have in Northern Ireland. But in Northern Ireland, agroforestry is supported as a farming measure. And in the Irish Agroforestry Forum, we've been trying to push forward that we think agroforestry should be supported both under the farming pillar and the forestry pillar, because it straddles both and it can deliver benefits in both. And we really need to look at innovation. There's some really innovative people out there who are using trees in farming systems. The Allshires at Rosscarbery putting pigs into agroforestry. And developing silvo-arable systems with sheep and poultry in them. So to conclude, really, agroforestry it integrates is a very climate positive, nature-based solution to some of our problems. It gives increased climate resilience. It lends itself very well to an organic system, and it can give support for grazing and forest land as a fire control measure, and it fits well into the proposed eco schemes and carbon farming projects, which the Minister was talking about. And we now have a strong environmental evidence base for that. But we need to really get expertise together. We need to provide encouragement. And that's why a group of us have formed the Irish Agroforestry Forum, and my email address at the end, and you can contact me over that. Our aim is to act as a coordinated voice to help educate people, to encourage training and training courses, and to disseminate the research that's out there, and to advise policy on how to adopt agroforestry. So thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry for running over a bit in time there, but please do contact me, because the equine sector is one that we do want to engage with, because we believe that agroforestry could play a significant role there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Fascinating talk. It certainly strikes me that many thoroughbred stud farms are well placed to further develop silvopasture systems with an abundance of trees and hedgerows already. on our farms. And in the Q&A later, there's some excellent questions coming in there. If you want to have a look in the chat box, Jim, in over the course of the next half an hour or so, and reflect on them, and we'll try and tackle them in the Q and the A. And in that, we might also get into practical steps that could be taken at farm level, while it's also highlighting, I think, the need of everybody on the call to ensure their viability as small breeders or large breeders within the policies going forward. So we'll get into that in the Q&A a little bit later. But next up, just to keep time moving, we'll ask John Geraghty to get himself set up. As I said before, John brings 3 decades of research, development, and consulting experience to the table to discuss the topic sustainable soil management for climate action. So I'll hand over to John.
Thank you, Cathal. I hope you can see that. I suppose to begin with, I'd just like to congratulate the ITBA on taking a positive step towards highlighting this among your members. And very often the farming community are on the back foot with relation to dealing with climate and climate issues, particularly in recent years and recent months. And I would just like to emphasize the positivity that you can bring, both in terms of the talks by John and Jim McAdam there. It just shows you that there's a lot of room, and as well as that, the comments of the minister as well, to make a very positive contribution to climate action in Ireland and the climate change bill as well. So I'm just going to maybe look at this in take maybe a different view of this, and take a view from the farmer's perspective, because very often this is where a lot of us find ourselves at the moment. Because when we look at the coverage in the national press and media, social media, which has become very, very toxic in terms of interactions and debate between different parties and different groups, the debate has become very polarized. And very often farmers on the ground, like yourselves, you find yourselves in the middle. On the one side, you've got policy under the Common Agriculture Policy, kind of pointing you in one direction. And then on the other side, you've got different government departments and also calls from the public and the youth looking for something else from agriculture itself. This is a graphic from the University of Berkeley and the UK Met Office, and this is temperature change in Ireland since 1901. And the blue lines are where temperatures were cooler than average, and the red lines are where the ambient temperature was warmer than average. And as you can see, since the 2000s, on average, temperatures have been getting warmer. And Keith Lampkin, who's a senior climatologist with Met Éireann, they've been conducting climate modeling, just like Professor Sweeney was talking about. And in Ireland, by mid-century, we expect temperatures on average getting warmer. We already see that we're experiencing that already. The growing season will become longer, and that can have implications in terms of our livestock enterprises and grazing in the field as well. And spring will on average come earlier, but as well as that, we're going to have warmer air, and that warmer air is going to hold more moisture, and that means we're going to have more heavy rainfall events. So as a land manager, how well are you placed to deal with these particular issues? All right. And the thing about it is, what I find striking is that we actually do not have a climate resilience plan on any farm in Ireland, north or south. I can guarantee you every land manager does not have a climate resilience plan in place. So when we're talking about sustainable soil management and the key management factors, we have to excel in each of these areas. Photosynthesis, right? Managing the carbon and mineral cycle, managing the water cycle, and then biodiversity. And they're not listed in order of priority because they're so integrated and so integral to one another. And we need to be able to manage these concurrently. I just want to show you this. It's going back to the 2010, and it's the United Nations Environment Programme, and it's the energy used for agriculture and food production. And The darker areas are where the greatest amount of energy has been used in terms of fossil fuel energy. And you can see the European Union is one of the darkest areas around the globe. And you actually have in South Asia and across Indonesia, you've also got dark areas, largely based on diesel that's used to pump irrigation systems and also the use of fertilizers. But Europe is no poster boy for, you know, efficient agricultural production because of this energy usage. And the reason that I bring this back to our sustainable soil management and the key management factors on farms is that all of our production is based around this equation, which is photosynthesis, okay? It's all based around that. And what we have is we actually have carbon dioxide and water giving us glucose and oxygen, all right? And in those situations, right, so plants take in carbon from the atmosphere, all right? They take in carbon, and with the action of sunlight, we actually create glucose and oxygen. And in that process, carbon dioxide is taken in by plants, all plants, grasses, forbs, herbs, and shrubs and trees. And we put carbon down into the soil. So we're not inclined to actually think about this equation and the attention to which it merits and it deserves for each and every one of us. Because as well as glucose, what's actually manufactured, as well as other sugars, there are proteins and carbohydrates, all right? So where does the sugar go? Well, much of it actually goes down into the roots, and Jim McAdam was actually talking about that and the relationships between soil fungi and mycorrhiza. So when we've got plants on land, we're actually managing photosynthesis. And the interesting thing is, the more diverse the plants, the shapes of the leaves, the heights, you know, the greater is our ability to harness that sunlight and that sun energy. And the deeper the rooting systems, the more we're pumping carbon deeper into the soil profile. But I just want to, I just want to show you this over here on the right-hand side of the screen. Look at the root system in perennial ryegrass, which is the major grass of choice in agricultural production systems in Ireland with the short roots. And look at another grass, cocksfoot, or even I could have timothy in there, which is very much favored in some farm grass mixes. But the deeper rooting system actually confers greater movement of carbon down into the soil and into the soil profile itself. So in the plants, we actually have different structures, okay? We've got celluloses, hemicelluloses, and lignin. And the structure of lignin is on the right-hand side there, but it's made up of 64% carbon, all right? And unfortunately, when we harvest plants, either through raising or making silage or haylage, and we take it off land, very often what we do is we replace it with fertilizer. And this is the structure of fertilizer. And there's no carbon in it at all. So you cannot reasonably take plant residue in any shape or form off land and expect to replace what you're after taking off with chemical fertilizer. In the United States, there's a lot of focus being given to this. Can dirt save the earth? This was the New York Times back in 2018. And the whole emphasis that carbon can pull, agriculture, can pull carbon out of the air and into the soil. But it's management that dictates how we're going to do that. And I show you this because on most farms, we're actually producing farmyard manure, and particularly on stud farms and horse breeding farms as well. And very often we're actually giving this away. We're sending it out from the farm itself. So we're actually exporting carbon from the farm. And with a little bit of effort and processing and composting of that, we can actually make a very beneficial nutrient fertilizer for ourselves. And that brings organic matter into the soil. Donald Rakowski, who was a soil scientist in the USDA lab in Morrison, Minnesota, he actually equated carbon to the keystone in an archway of all nutrient cycling and recycling. And the carbon in that organic matter, it's crucial for all soil physics biological processes. Indeed, it's soil organic matter in the earth, okay, near the surface, that regulates all climatic and biological processes around the globe. So in terms of managing our land, we also have rainfall. We've got non-effective rainfall and we've got effective rainfall. So when you graze land tightly, graze grasslands very tightly, what you're doing is you're exposing soil. And if you've got heavy rainfall, which we're going to have as predicted by Met Éireann and on a more frequent basis, what happens is that rainfall splash, it creates a miniature explosion on the soil surface. And just to show you what that means, you actually can compact the surface of the exposed soil. And that leads to non-infiltration of water and runoff, leading to flooding off-site or on the farm itself. And the alternative is where we've got plant or residue cover over the soil surface, we increase the amount of infiltration into the soil and percolation. And this is all to do with management. This is back in County Meath in November 2002, where I was called out to a farm there. And just by changing management practices, with the same amount of heavy rainfall in the previous fortnight, we were able to go from the left-hand picture to the right-hand picture. Very often, if you're encountering a problem on your farm, if you keep doing what you've been doing, you will just exacerbate or compound the problem. You need to think about this. And this is actually from a study in Australia I was on a number of years ago, but this is the fence line. And this is about getting water down into the soil. But look at what happens on the paddock itself. Now, by the way, nutrient movement into vegetation happens in solution, okay? All nutrients, they move in solution, either suspended or completely dissolved. So when soil dries out, which we're going to get in drier periods, we don't get that movement into the actual plant, and therefore the nutrition of the animal is affected. And this is grassland down in the southeast where I'm from. This is a dairy farm where grass has been grazed. Just a couple of days later, same amount of rainfall. Stock had just left this field. This is after grazing with multi-species. But just look at the difference between the two of them. So in the one case, a farmer is minding soil, and on the right-hand side, this farmer, whether he realizes it or not, is mining soil. So this amount of grazing, and David is going to cover it in more detail, the tighter you graze, the more you're exposing soil. But what's happening underneath the ground and the surface is you're actually cutting down on root growth, okay? When you cut vegetation, you actually arrest root growth quite significantly. And this is something that we need to look at in terms of managing grasslands in particular around the country. We talked about biodiversity, and all biodiversity is based around the relationship between photosynthesis, plants, root development, and the creation of organic matter, okay? This is from Professor Elaine Ingham from Oregon State University, and she has developed this graphic with relation to the soil food web since the early 1980s. And all soil microbiology is based on this soil organic matter and the importance of bacteria and fungi and nutrient cycling and recycling. But the point about it is, if you look at the right-hand side of that slide there, what you have, if you get the left-hand side right and you get the soil microbiology working well, you automatically create habitat for mammals and for farmland birds. So when we actually leave some residue in the field, plant residue, okay, in the form of decaying or dying leaves on the soil surface, we have a dramatic impact in terms of biodiversity as well. We've got ground nesting birds like lapwing, the grey partridge, the skylark. We've got seed and insect eating birds like buntings, finches, the linnet, the yellowhammer, and the stockdove. And they in turn are predated on by carnivorous birds like the hen harrier or the sparrowhawk. But the point about it is the lack of soil cover, it actually negatively affects habitats, and consequently it affects food sources. All right. Now, interestingly, a lot of the biodiversity initiatives are focused on the borders and the margins of fields on farms. And as somebody that's working at the coalface, we know that you're only talking about between 5 and 10% of farmland when we focus just solely on those margins and hedgerows. And we actually need, and we have a benefit for farmers in getting biodiversity out into that other 90% of fields that can be enhanced with agroforestry, like Professor McAdam was saying. So again, we get back to this. This is all about management, the management of photosynthesis, the management of the carbon and mineral cycle, the management of the water cycle, and consequently, the management and positive management of biodiversity. Now, in the agriculture sector, we've made a lot of mistakes with relation to climate, and we continue to make them because various sectors are often engaged in greenwashing. And I show you this. By the way, this is from the fashion industry. It's nothing to do with agriculture at all, but just to show you that agriculture is not exclusive with the tendency towards engaging in greenwashing. And if the ITBA are going to bring this forward, this is what they need to avoid. Making false claims, kind of purposely being non-specific about operations or materials, pointing towards lesser evils, you know, irrelevance in terms of, you know, using materials with relation to how unfriendly they might be. For example, plastics, fossil fuel inputs, whatever that might be. And then there are hidden trade-offs, and then, which is quite topical, really. You know, there a lot of people are making claims that cannot be substantiated. There's an automatic and inherent assumption, for example, that because you've got grasslands, you're fixing carbon. You're engaged in carbon sequestration. But in actual fact, even in the Irish context, the EPA will tell you a lot of intensive grassland is a net carbon emitter. And back to government, we started with Minister Hackett, but one of the things now we're actually seeing is we have government engagement, but I would really question that because the United Nations Environment Programme has been reviewing this from an international basis. And even though forests, agroforestry and agriculture make up over 30% of the solution to climate change and the ravages that can occur, like Professor Sweeney was highlighting, they still receive less than 3% of climate financing. Okay, in the OECD, Alan Matthews posted a report just earlier this week where only $1 out of 6 is actually been put into climate financing. $1 out of every $6 that's going into agriculture support. And the European Union has, in recent years, they've spent over 100 billion euros on supporting agriculture. And the net result is we've actually seen an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So we're back here. And we're back with the rabbit in the headlights. And are we looking at climate action or are we looking at climate inaction? But for farmers on the ground, all of us, we need to stop and think what it is we're actually doing, okay? And what can I do on my farm now to make it more resilient? And that's a big ask for all of us, but I think there will be support and there will be encouragement and there will be technical help there if you want to embark on that journey, okay? And I'll finish it there.
Thank you, John. Wow, just a great talk from the perspective of the farmer on the ground, I think, as many of us on the call are, and highlighting the circularity there of the need to treat this as a circular flow, all these things that we're talking about, rather than a series of things to tackle in some sort of linear way. The questions will come up. I think that you asked a pertinent question at the end there, just about how can we put this into practice on farms up and down the country, and what role will incentive play in that? And there will be carrots and there will be sticks when it comes to this entire process of getting ourselves into this thought process of circularity and using our management practices on the soil. And good soil management, I think, was the keystone of what you were talking about there, and seeing that from our perspective. And of course, you know, the simple fact is that, you know, good soil management grows good horses, and that's what we're all invested in to try and rear as good a horse as we all possibly can. So thanks very much for that, John. There'll be loads of questions, I think, coming in from on the basis of that in the Q&A at the end. But next up, we have David O'Connell. And again, I'm just conscious of time, so we'll hand straight over to David and let him get started. Thanks, David.
Look, we've heard a lot of stats here this morning, and a lot of them are you know, very frightening stats, really. I think probably the most frightening one is that John Garrity has 30 years experience. John is younger than us, so there's a frightening stat. I'm just going to cover the impact of climate change. You know, from a farmer's perspective, it's both physical and chemical. You know, so there are very obvious changes that are happening, but there are also a lot of unseen ones, and I would suggest probably a lot of unknowns within that. We just look at soil type, we look at the role of soil and herbage analysis, fertilizer programs, soil compaction, and grazing management. Climate change is impacting on agriculture, and I think as farmers we're all seeing that on a day-to-day basis. You know, and we're trying to maybe understand and pick up on the trends that are happening. You know, what we're definitely seeing, and this is backed up by data from Met Éireann, you know, we're probably the incidence of a storm is increasing. Our water distribution in terms of rainfall is also changing, and we're seeing more sort of high precipitation events. We're also seeing a lower number of frost days, and probably the distribution, and this year is probably be a good indicator of that, in terms of, you know, very significant grass frost being experienced in May, and the delay in the onset of grass production. It's quite likely that our dry spells are going to increase by 2050, and the incidence of that is probably going to be more felt in the eastern part of the country. And then also we're quite likely to have sort of longer growing seasons, which has been referred to during some of the presentations there earlier. And it's likely to be the order by 2050 of, you know, an extended grazing season of 35 to 40 days. I'm just going to skip through these slides. You know, just the period, I would have shown these before. We had a sort of a reasonably condensed period between October 2017 and the summer of 2018, where we had, you know, a storm. You know, we then had the snows, which everyone remembers in sort of February, March time. And then we did the extended dry spell during the summer of 2018. So we did quite a number of diverse climate events in a very short space of time. And, you know, that's probably quite likely to continue and probably exacerbate over the next period of time. The other thing too, probably just as a sort of a generic comment, you know, we've started to look at climate change over the last probably 6 to 7 years. And when we started to look at it initially, you know, we said, well, look, it was something that was going to impact, you know, on our great grandchildren or grandchildren. And as the thing progresses in a relatively short space of time, it's quite evident, you know, that it's going to be the tail end of our careers, and it's going to hugely impact on our children's lives. You know, so what can we do? You know, the target is to limit the increase in climate degrees. That is a really, really difficult ask, and everyone is going to have to work on it. When we start to hit increases of 2 degrees, plus, you know, the Earth is going to be, you know, pretty difficult place to live, and above that probably doesn't bear thinking about. Greta Thunberg, I think, has done, you know, probably more than anyone, certainly more than most, in terms of highlighting the issues. And Kerry mentioned it, I think it was yesterday in one of the meetings, that if Mother Nature had a grandchild, it would be Greta Thunberg, and I think that's a pretty apt quote. Okay, so from a breeder's perspective, you know, when we get up every morning, our objective is to produce a sound racehorse, you know, and I think we don't have to lose that objective, but we certainly have to look at what we're doing to the land. Does it help improve that? Does it help improve that outcome? and also, you know, how does climate change sort of dovetail with that? And when you begin to think about it, you know, the two interact quite nicely together. Okay, so the first thing is, in Ireland, we're very fortunate. We're very fortunate on a number of fronts. Whilst we are seeing changes in climate change on the day-to-day, you know, in terms of rainfall distribution and frosts and dry spells, you know, largely speaking, you know, our houses aren't being threatened, our livelihood is not being threatened. So because it's not as perceived as an imminent danger, we're sort of pushing it out a bit. So we're probably insulated to a large degree. And there's elements of climate change that actually might be quite nice. The other thing is the soil which we have in this country is a really significant wealth and resource. And we, you know, as farmers, we probably take it for granted. You know, we can all sit in our sitting rooms and look out the window on the grass we grow, largely because of how rich our soils are. And John made a reference to organic matter. In general terms, the organic matter levels in the Irish soils are quite high. You know, they're 7, 8, 9, compared to, say, places like the southeast of England or in the market, where you're looking at the order of 3% or less. And if you go to some of the sandier soils in continental Europe, you know, they're less again. So as I say, we're very fortunate, and we probably get away with blue murder, really, you know, in terms of what we do to our soils because of the resilience of it and because of the richness of it. When we talk about soils, it largely ranges from what we call light soils, which would have a higher proportion of sand and silt, to heavier clay soils. And that's going to be increasingly significant as we go forward. And I think people should know the composition of their soils. You know, they should do a soil structural analysis and analyze the components of sand, silt, and clay, and where do their soils lie, because it is going to have an impact in terms of how we manage the soils. The other thing then is climate impacts on soil conditions throughout the year, and it impacts both physically and chemically. And we need to be conscious of that, and we need to understand it, and we need to know, you know, what we do to manage it, you know, in a more sustainable manner. So when it rains on heavier soils and you've horses out on land, that's what happens. And if we're expecting not to have a repercussion from that, so there's laws, John has made reference to, you know, the exposure to soil biodiversity by exposing the soil and reducing the vegetation. But there's also, from the perspective of producing a better racehorse, there's also going to be a knock-on effect. If your soil is damaged, it's going to become less productive. And this year we would have seen, you know, out on farms when we're walking the paddocks for various clients, you know, normally buttercups is an inherent problem on farms. And this year it has been you know, probably the incidence has been noticeably higher. So if you damage soil, you're going to create a shift in terms of the species that are grown in that soil. So I said the impact of it is quite obvious. In waterlogged soils, you know, where they get damaged, you have a lack of oxygen, and oxygen is a very interesting element. You know, we're all very familiar in terms of our fertilizer when we're putting out nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, and we analyze our soils for P's and K's. But oxygen is probably the most important element of all, and no one talks about it in that regard. So if you have a lack of oxygen, you have negative bacteria, negative fungi, and there's an influence on pH, you know, so that you get more acidic pHs. So there's a shift in the overall balance of the soil. And as a result of that, we get poor root development, and we get restrictions in the availability of certain essential nutrients. A lot of my career has been built around minerals and mineral nutrition. So fundamentally, if you have a mineral deficiency or a mineral imbalance, it starts in the soil, and there's a progression from the soil to the plant and into the animal. So if you're going to start to manage it, you need to start in the soil. That's basically where it all begins. And there's certain things, you know, if you have damaged your soil, if you have low pH, you're going to increase the incidence of metals like manganese, iron, aluminium, and then you're going to reduce the availability of essential elements such as copper, cobalt, and zinc. So we need to start looking at the soil as the first place in terms of managing that, rather than going out and maybe buying expensive nutrients, mineral supplements that are administered through the feed or through pastes or licks. Why are minerals so important? They basically impact in three broad areas. One is the whole area of reproductive performance. So if you need a mare to conceive, copper is very much involved in that. So you need good copper levels. If you want to sustain a pregnancy, iodine and selenium are very much involved. So you need optimum levels of iodine and selenium. If you want your horses to thrive, you need good levels of copper. You need good levels of zinc. And when I say good levels, you need optimum levels. You know, they're very much involved in that. And then probably the third area, which is obviously key, you know, to producing horses. We need to produce horses that are basically that are going to develop as athletes, and we need really good orthopedic development. And the whole balance, the whole mineral balance in our soils and in our grasses is absolutely fundamental to that. We need good levels of calcium. We need good levels of phosphorus. We need good levels of magnesium. We need copper for joint development. So we need to understand that linkage and integrate all of that in terms of our sort of decision-making process, with a view to producing a better athlete and a better racehorse. And largely because of our soils, we've developed a reputation for that. So what we need to do is try and develop that and understand that, you know, in a much better way. So there's the expression, a very common expression within the horse world, no hoof, no horse. This is a photograph taken from a horse during the summer of 2018. And basically that's what selenium toxicity looks like, okay? So if you've, selenium is a particularly interesting element in that there's a very narrow range within horses between having a deficient amount, a sufficient amount, and a toxic amount, okay? So a horse's daily requirement for selenium is about 3 milligrams a day. You know, if they're getting 4 and 5 milligrams, you're heading into the toxic region and producing an outcome like that. And if you're below, you know, if you're in the region of 1.5 or 2 milligrams a day, you're in the low to deficient region. So it's an incredibly narrow band in terms of having enough or having too much. But that is the potential outcome of it. And we started to notice the incidence of this happening increasing in 2013, and it absolutely went off the Richter scale in 2018. And it was no coincidence that 2018 was one of our drier summers. So why did it happen? So this is one particular paddock. We've analysed hundreds of paddocks. We profiled paddocks in terms of grass analysis, in terms of the mineral profile. That particular farm historically would have had an optimum level of selenium right the way through. And this is over a period of 20, 30 years that we would have monitored it. But you can see there, we've taken one paddock from the farm and we've graphed it from sort of 2013 up to 2021. And the figures are sort of 5 on the vertical column are parts per million. So once you're below 1 part per million, you're sort of in the general optimum to safe zone. Once it goes above 1, and certainly when you get into the realms of 5 plus, you're in a very dangerous area in terms of having selenium toxicity. So during that period, you know, there was peaks in 2015. There was a peak in 2013, and there was lesser peaks in 2015. Short, not sustained peaks in 2016, 2017. And then in 2018, as I say, it went off the Richter scale. 2019, we noticed peaks. And already this year, after the recent dry spell in the last fortnight, we're starting to notice peaks. We would have a number of farms that are in this scenario. We had quite a bit of engagement with the Equine Centre in 2013, and I know they had incidents coming into them as well. This is more common than people realize, and it's a hidden impact of climate change. And as the predictions are going forward that the east is going to become warmer and we're going to experience it more, the incidence of this is likely to increase rather than decrease. This is an interesting picture. Again, it's obviously not a horse, but it's in terms of the impact of mineral deficiencies and mineral imbalances in our grass. This is a young bullock, and most farmers will recognize copper deficiency where we start to get the brown coat. This is the same animal 80 days later after a copper supplement. So it's quite dramatic, the change, and the effect is very obvious, okay? For all we know, that animal 80 days later could still be copper deficient. It could be suffering from a subclinical copper deficiency, okay? But it's not, it's probably 85–90% of the way there. Whereas the previous photograph 80 days earlier, the animal is obviously copper sick. Again, I would suspect that there's a lot of subclinical problems happening on farms across a range of species, not just cattle and horses, you know, sheep as well. You know, it has to be counted for. This is copper in the same paddock, and you can see the degree of fluctuation in terms of the copper levels in the grass. And copper is directly, the copper availability is directly attributable to climate changes. It's particularly moisture, soil moisture content. And as John referred to, you know, a lot of these nutrients move in the soil. And in terms of plant availability, they need to go in soil solution for roots to access them. So as our climate becomes more variable, you know, and it's not just copper and selenium, you have iodine, cobalt, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, whole range of elements that are going to be more variable in terms of their uptake. And the other thing to bear in mind here is that all of these elements interact with each other. And generally speaking, what you're looking for is an optimum balance, which is virtually impossible to achieve. But you can have high levels of antagonists. So if you have high levels of manganese, iron, aluminium, molybdenum, sulfur, all of those elements are going to interfere with the uptake of your copper. So if climate change is going to impact on the levels of copper in the grass, it's also going to impact in terms of the level of antagonists in your grass. And all of these have knock-on effects in terms of the well-being of our animals and the performance and the output. So these are things that really need to be looked at. And I think there's an awful lot more research needs to be brought into this arena. You know, back in the mid 80s, mineral licks were not heard of on farms in Ireland. A guy called Phelim Green sort of pioneered it through his company Uniblock. Now they're standard practice. You know, so farmers know that they need to supplement. What we need to do now is to get more accurate data in terms of the levels in our grasses and in our soils, and supplement much more accurately. And soil nutrition and farm nutrition is not just about nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. It's not about 10, 10, 20 and 18, 6, 12. It must be much broader than that. This is just some data. It's probably a little bit historic now at this stage in terms of grasses that would have gone through our lab. But 84% of them are providing sort of optimum amount of calcium, 70% phosphorus, 63% magnesium. Then when you get down to the mineral elements, very few of them have the optimum levels of these elements in our grasses. And interestingly then, the levels of antagonists, potassium, iron, manganese, I would probably include molybdenum and sulfur in that as well. You know, and the impact of them on the availability of our grasses. Again, that needs to be understood and more importantly, really needs to be measured on farms. I've sort of titled the topic Back to Basics. Over the years, and I would have mentioned this many times before, the people that we've learned most from are what the Irish farmer terms a good stockman. And a good stockman tends to be very observant and he questions. And when a farmer is out in the field and he's looking at his grasses, he's looking at his soils, he's looking at his animals, and he's asking questions, that challenges advisors. And I think we as advisors really need to be challenged now in terms of the observations that these guys are making and, you know, using the analytical data to start to come up with answers. We need to promote healthy soils. We need to promote active biology. And it's quite obvious that that needs to be done from a climate change perspective, but it also needs to be done from a production perspective. If our soils are healthier and we've more active biology, we are going to have better horses. You know, we don't need a research study to tell us that. That's just plain common sense. We need good soil nutrition, and what I mean by that is an optimum balance between all the various elements in the soil. We don't need excesses of nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium in our soils. We need optimum levels, and we can probably get away with lower levels, particularly within the horse industry, than would be required, you know, in terms of dairy production or beef production. We also need to look at our grazing management, and John referenced the carbon emissions from cattle and cows as opposed to sheep. Sheep, I think he mentioned a figure of 8 kilograms, and for cattle it's about 120. And traditionally on stud farms, we have mixed graze cattle with horses during the summer months. Maybe we should start to look at maybe introducing more sheep into that variable, you know, in terms of our grazing management practices. And we also need to look at rotation of our paddocks and the resting of our paddocks. You know, we need to look at how we're doing this. These are all simple things, but we need to be looking at them in more detail, and we need to be doing them more effectively. These are 3 figures. Again, I picked it up from a lecture on grassland management for dairy farms. And essentially what it means is that if you're trying to produce hay and haylage, it's 2.5 times more expensive than an animal just grazing grass. If you're feeding them a concentrate feed, it's 4 times more expensive. Okay, so now we're going to see changes in terms of our grazing days. So, you know, we're going to have 35, 40, potentially 35 or 40 more days extra grazing. So that makes a huge amount of economic sense, you know, to maximize the value of our grazed grass, as opposed to particularly feeding carbon intensive and expensive concentrate feeds. And we would have a number of clients, probably about 6 or 7, over the last 7 to 8 year period, have really sort of taken that on board, have put an awful lot of effort into maximizing their grass utilization. And they're all seeing the benefits from it. They're seeing, I would suspect, probably better performance in terms of their horses and their daily live weight gain. And they're seeing a reduction in their concentrate bill. So it's a win-win. And again, climate change and efficiency should go hand in hand. And I think, again, the message, you know, John Kerry has put up the rabbit in the headlights slide there. I think farmers need greater direction. And I think with very, very little prompting, they will actually see the common sense in what we're trying to promote here. You know, if you can get more benefit from your grass utilization, you know, it makes sense from a climate change perspective, but also from an economic efficiency perspective as well. We're looking at minimizing our fertilizer applications by 30% by 2030, reduce our herbicide inputs. That should be very easy, or relatively easy to achieve in a stud farm situation. You know, we're not really pushing the systems, and I would suspect that we could possibly even go beyond that. So in terms of, you know, what we're trying to do here, the first thing we need to focus on is our roots and the contact between the plant and the soil, and that is our roots. So we're looking to get our roots as big and as deep as we can, and we need them to grow in a nice environment that they can actually thrive. Again, I'll come back to balanced nutrient availability, good soil structure, and active biology. So, you know, we conduct a lot of lectures to both in the national stud, but to young professionals coming into the industry through the national stud, and also through the Darley Flying Start program. And again, one of the things that we say to them, that the first thing that they need to do when they're going to take over a farm is actually go out and buy a spade and start digging and looking at the soils and observe what's happening. Okay. Now, again, common sense will tell you, you know, if you're trying to grow and develop a good root system in that scenario where you have a compacted discolored soil, you know, in the top, whatever it is, 10, 20 centimeters, your grasses aren't going to thrive. And you're going to look at developing more surface rooting, unpalatable, non-productive grasses, mainly Agrostis species, okay? So we want to move from that scenario to this scenario, okay? Where you have a good root structure, active soil biology. You can begin to see, you know, a vast amount of aerated pores. Again, I'll come back to oxygen. Oxygen is so fundamental to all of this, and very few people talk about it. And we need to, first, when we're working as advisors on farms, start to dig trial pits, see what's happening, and establish, have we got that scenario, or have we got this scenario? And if we're in the prior scenario, how do we move from that to that? And it can be done, and it can be done relatively easily. You know, and as I say, this is all common sense stuff. You have a good cultivar, it's friable, it looks healthy, fresh new words, fresh new roots, good crumb structure, you have good worm activity. And interestingly, if you put your nose to that, it's going to smell much fresher than the previous slide. Again, all very simple but very measurable observations that farmers need to start looking at. And as I say, go back to about, and our grandfathers they will understand this very, very easily. And I think we're at a tipping point that we have a generation here who remember what their grandfathers did, and they can talk to their parents. And we just need to sort of get back to that and maybe understand that a little bit better and not forget it. As I say, you know, we buy a spade, and we need to observe and analyze the soil and the grass. So generally speaking, we would analyze our soils for every 4 or 5 years. I think that probably needs to be looked at. Maybe, you know, that the frequency of that needs to be promoted. The Department of Agriculture have brought out a very comprehensive soils tender now, where they're looking for laboratories to conduct a pilot analysis on farms, but they're not looking for what we would have historically done, which was line P and K. They're looking at carbon measurement, they're looking at nitrogen measurement, and then they're looking at a whole range of micronutrient analysis. So there's going to be a large amount of developments in this area. One thing that has baffled me over the years is why the grass mineral profile is not being analysed on farms, and it's not being done. It should be done more widely. We've been routinely doing it for the last 30 years. Information from it is absolutely enormous. It serves as a check on your fertilizer programs. There are certain elements that you cannot, or it's difficult to measure accurately in the soil, particularly things like iodine and selenium, which are very essential nutrients. And we would see time and time again, and I'm sure a lot of the participants here have seen it, there are a lot of mineral supplements being sold to the bloodstock sector. But actually people don't know what they need and how much they need. So if you know the copper status of your basic diet, which is the grass for a big proportion of the year, and if your grass is supplying 100 or 150 milligrams per day of copper, and your horse needs 800 milligrams a day, well then the difference between what the grass is supplying and what the horse requires is what should be going in the mineral supplement. So you take the guesswork out of this. And particularly for an element like copper, which is so fundamental in terms of joint development, it's absolutely daft not to know what these figures are. If you're running any business, you know, so it doesn't matter whether you're running a stationary business or a pub or whatever, you need accurate information. A stud farm business and a farming business is no different. We need accurate information to make informed and good management decisions. And it's not just scientific analysis, it is also performance analysis in terms of what's happening in the farm. You know, what is your percentage conception to first service? You know, what is the incidence of lost pregnancies? You know, what is the incidence of orthopedic development disorders? You know, all of these, what's happening with our soils? Have we healthy soils? All of this is information, and it needs to be compiled in a logical format in order to help us make more, basically better decisions. pH is hugely influential. I'm just watching the time here, Carl. I'm probably going to skip through a good bit of the next few slides. But fundamentally, if we have an acidic pH, metals, which is going to reduce our gas performance. If we have a very alkaline pH, we have other issues then in terms of copper and zinc. So we need to look at that very clearly. And we cannot look at pH as an isolated measurement. It also needs to be looked at in terms of our calcium status. We need to be very accurate in terms of our lime application. So we need to establish, we don't want to be putting on, as is the case on the right-hand side, 2 or 3 tons per acre. We possibly need to be looking at putting out 150 and 200 kilograms per acre. So little and often, but very measured. This is soil organic matter. It's in a tilly situation. The picture on the right reflects the hedgerow. The picture on the left reflects taken from the middle of the field. That's been a field that's been continuously cropped. And the organic matter status has depleted. That's the only difference. So organic matter is absolutely fundamental in terms of our management. And it's definitely something that we need to look at on stud farms. The role of organic matter is just basic common sense. You're recycling nutrients back into the land. I'm going to skip through all of these. We need to encourage a much more diverse soil biology. Spent bedding, this is a picture that I came across there during research for this article. Obviously a very religious household. But John Gertie made reference to it, spent bedding. It's an absolute massive resource on stud farms. And it's either been given away or people are paying for it to have to be taken away. That just does not make sense. And a lot of the bigger operators, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with what they're doing, they've invested in compost facilities on the farm because they realize this and they've seen the difference that it makes. A horse produces 50 kilograms per year of nitrogen and it produces 9 kilograms per year of phosphorus, okay? Typically from analyzing spent bedding, you're probably looking at about 4 to 5 kilograms of nitrogen per ton, and you're looking at phosphorus content of somewhere north of a kilo per ton. Phosphorus is a really, really expensive nutrient. It's something that we should be looking at and we should be managing. And I think if a national calculation was done in terms of the phosphorus stock and organic fertilizers in Ireland, it would far surpass the actual requirements for crop growth as new. And it's a very limited resource. It's basically, they're talking about, lifetime limits of 40, somewhere between 40 and 100 years in terms of food production. And again, we're not managing it. And also compost, it's a slow release fertilizer, which is what we're looking for in terms of grass production in a stud farm situation, supplies organic matter. And we need to look at composting facilities on farms. I hope the Tuttles won't mind me mentioning them, but this is what they're doing. They're very effectively and very simply producing a very, very good product that should be made more available on a wider scale. I'm just going to skip through all of this here, but essentially what we're looking at is basically, treating soil, putting out our accurate applications of our fertilizer products according as we need them. And if we don't need them, don't put them out. There are various machines on the market in terms of aerating our soil. Oxygen, it's probably the most important element in the soil and the cheapest. This is a soil aerator machine with the option of adding in grass seeds. And again, we haven't even spoken about species diverse. They're much better at it in the UK. When you go onto stud farms in the UK, you're going to see yarrow, you're going to see plantain, you're going to see chicory. Again, that's something that we need to look at in an Irish context. This is just a demo in terms of aerated versus non-aerated. They talk about a yield difference of 30% increase. That particular sward is probably too pure. It's not ideal in terms of what we're looking at going forward. We need to look at our drain management. How do we maximize the benefit from and minimize the damage from precipitation events going forward? This is surface rooting across the species. We want to stop encouraging that. We need to encourage this sort of a scenario. We need to develop our root systems. If we don't manage our soils properly, this is quite a common sight on stud farms. This is what's going to happen. We're going to have less productive grasses and it's going to impact in terms of animal performance. We need to try and promote this. And it is very, very easy to go from that to that. It can be done within a matter of 6 to 8 weeks with proper management. And one of the key ways of doing it is sheep. They're absolutely terrific scavengers, and they don't emit as much carbon as cattle. So just to summarize, you know, we need to make more use of sheep. We need to aerate our soils. We need to accurately apply our fertilizers, and we need to look at the source of it. We need to move from being reliant on inorganic sources and look at the organic options. Ideally, we need to look at resting our paddocks over the winter months. We need to look at soil aeration and, you know, mixed grazing. We also need to assess weed populations. We need to, if we see the weed that we don't want, we need to, rather than going out with a herbicide and treating it, we need to ask, why is it there in the first place? And can we prevent it or minimize the incidents going forward? I'm going to skip at that. I would also like to just acknowledge, you know, the contribution of Shane and Cathal here today. I would particularly like to acknowledge the work that Kerry Ryan has done. She's put a huge amount of effort, and she's one of the most efficient organisers that I think I've ever come across. And I'd also like to acknowledge the contributions there from the other contributors. It's been a really interesting set of presentations there this morning. It would be lovely to be in a forum where we could discuss all of this in person. And finally, then I would like to acknowledge the contribution from the team at OCAE over the past while, Ivan O'Neill, Cathy O'Donoghue, and in particular from a climate change perspective, the information that Karen Mahan has supplied us. So thank you.
Thank you, David. And just look, another fascinating talk. I think everyone will agree, just on farm level analysis on the management of soils, kind of carrying on from John's talk earlier, the impact of nutrient and mineral deficiency. And I think one of the key points that David made is around the holy grail there of climate change and efficiency and viability of small farms going hand in glove. And if we can get to that stage where both of those two things can go hand in hand, that's essentially the holy grail that we're all seeking, to retain our viability while at the same time making these advancements in looking after our soils and looking after the climate in general. Look, we've run over a little bit. I think it would have been criminal to stop any of our speakers, and I know David had to race through the end there a little bit, but it would have been criminal from me as chair so I do apologize to everybody if you were hoping to get your sandwiches by 12 o'clock, but if anyone does have to leave, you know, please feel free, and we thank you, and we thank you for attending today. But if everybody's okay, especially our speakers, we might just continue the discussion for another 10 or 15 minutes if we can, just to ask a couple of questions. Some really good comments and questions coming in through the chat, and some sent in advance of the meeting today. So if we're all okay, we'll keep going for a little bit longer. And I might just start with Professor Sweeney, with John, who, you know, John gave us a somewhat frightening, I think, but realistic overview of the scale of the climate crisis and the causes and the effects of that. But John, if we might just take it back to a farm level for a minute and get to the sort of practical things that we as stud farmers can do. Is there anything in your view, you know, to create more environmentally sustainable practices on farms? What one or two steps might you have us take?
Well, I think I've learned an awful lot this morning from the other speakers. They have really given quite a reservoir, if you like, of ideas in terms of practical steps. And the main message I got from them was the importance of maintaining a healthy sward in the paddocks. And in particular, I think one of the problems that came across to me was that, you know, horses' hooves can compact soils very effectively. And what came across as well from all of the other three speakers was the importance of protecting the soil and enabling the grasses to outcompete the weeds. So from a practical point of view, avoiding poaching is the key. And from a climate point of view, I know David was talking about the extended grazing season, and this certainly is happening at the moment. The grasses are growing earlier, but the problem is that if we have wetter winters, you may not be able to put the horses out at the same time as your grasses are growing. So it's going to require sensitivity to avoid poaching, especially in the springtime, especially in wet springs. And of course, wetness also will be problems for cleaning stables, for minimizing possible runoff into adjoining watercourses. I think that's going to be a vital thing as well. as are, and I was delighted to hear the other three speakers emphasizing the importance of minimizing inputs. It will make your stud farms more profitable if you can minimize fertilizer inputs, if you can minimize herbicides and pesticide inputs. I know you have a particular problem with horses and buttercups, for example, so it may well be that, you know, spot spray maybe once, try and get rid of the problem in the way that David was describing once and for all, rather than sort of going out repeatedly to spray herbicides and even pesticides as well. From a bigger macro point of view, get electric vehicles for moving your horses around is one thing that you could maybe think about a bit more. Minimize your air travel. You're among the most active air travelers, I think, in Ireland at times, and these will help. And especially going back to what Jim McAdam said at the beginning, I'm really converted to the importance of planting broadleaf trees and putting agroforestry into your stud farms as a way of tackling all of these multiple climate change problems as well. And finally, you know, lobby. The Common Agricultural Policy is currently being decided in Brussels. I haven't heard the horse industry's views being expressed. I haven't heard what their needs and what their demands are. And I think it's very important that you mobilize and get across that you're an important industry which requires consideration in any carbon budget that comes down the line later this year.
That's brilliant. Thanks, John. I think you make a great point, and hopefully this is the sort of starting point of that process for readers in the bloodstock industry and the ITBA to get more involved and to have the benefit of what we've heard today from all of the speakers. You did mention, just moving on to Jim, Professor McAdam, you know, who gave us such an unbelievable overview of silvopastoral principles. And I think we felt that we were somewhat, you know, already well placed in relation to some trees and decent hedgerows on our farms. But in terms of next steps, Jim, if people were interested in taking a sort of an easy first or second step, what would you recommend as a method of establishing agroforestry on our stud farms?
Okay, thanks, Cathal. And just before I answer that, I'll just tie in with there was a chat question come up there, which is very much related to John's from I think Karen, that was on poaching, the importance, and this is a really important issue because the key selling point that I'm finding with the officials in the north here is the fact that silvopasture reduces poaching because the trees dry out the pasture, or they allow water to run away from the pasture quicker. And, you know, over winter, just that land that has trees on it, it's just much better carrying capacity. It's not poaching, and it's allowing animals, horses, cows, to stay out longer. And that's reducing ammonia, it's reducing animal health problems when animals are housed. So that the poaching issue is a seriously big issue in a policy driver in the north. But to come back to the question you asked, the first thing is advice, seek advice. And I think now, with, as I mentioned, we've formed a sort of a conglomerate of the best advice we can give. Now, although there hasn't been a lot of research done on agroforestry in Ireland, there is a lot there. We've been part of European consortia, and there's a lot of good examples out there of research that's very applicable to Ireland, and that's being accumulated in the Irish Agroforestry Forum. We have details of that, so we're going to encourage people just to make event of that. And we have a lot of experience from individuals, particularly organic farmers who are growing trees in different contexts. The next stage really is the type of land you're trying to grow on. Pick your I would never be prescriptive about a type of tree. Pick your tree to suit your site. Some trees will grow better in wet soils, some in others. Of course, nearly all our early research is done with ash, and those ash now, a lot of them are hit by ash dieback disease. One of the things I have, and an interesting little piece of research that's going on at the minute that's funded, is we believe that trees planted at wider spacings, like a silvopasture, may be more resistant to ash dieback, or at least get it much slower, because ash dieback is transmitted to the trees each year by the leaves that fall in the autumn. They're infected. The fungi produce spores which reinfect the tree. If you have a silvopasture, we find the animals graze the ash leaves very quickly. As soon as they fall to the ground, you're keeping a clean sward, so you're not having that source of reinfection. So there's a bit of research tied in with some research going on in North America to show that actually agroforestry may help reduce, it won't stop the trees because there will be spores in the air, but it will prevent that, you know, direct closer infection. So select your tree species, look at your grazing system, it suits your animals best. If you've got a hectare or two of agroforest in your land, save that to the autumn, let the grass accumulate so you can extend your grazing season, and use a rotational grazing much more. That means that it minimizes the impact that the animals have with the trees if they're starting to nibble the bark or push on them. Look to things like David mentioned a lot about nutrients and mineral balance. A lot of tree fodder are very valuable nutrients. For example, willow has a lot of health benefits for animals as well as humans, aspirin, but it also is high in phosphate. It's the same as good quality grass, and it's got a whole range of trace elements and minerals. Other trees the same, and there's a lot of published data on that now, particularly done in England, on the nutritive value of tree fodders, because your animals will graze those leaves and forage. That will reduce methane emissions from them even further than they are. So those are sort of initial steps. Think about, look, get advice. There's now advice building out there, but look at your land type, pick your trees to suit it, and then pick a grazing system that fits in with what your farm's grazing profile is.
Thanks, Jim. Just a fascinating, and can I just say as well, I think you answered John Watson's question there in the purpose of your answer.
Yes,
there
yes, about the Irish dieback, yeah.
Which was great. And just to take the antithesis, I suppose, of the poaching question and take it more from a microbial viewpoint. Alan Crichton was asking, you know, if the land is drying out better with the addition of a silvopastoral principle, is there a greater fear of microbial growth, such as, you know, rhodococcus or Clostridia in the soil?
Yeah, so Alan's question, and we've never actually encountered that issue. Grass swards our research showed that we started the work. The computer prediction was that quite quickly after 6 or 7 would indicate. In other words, there are physiological that problem with microbial disease or anything like that. That's not to say it isn't there. We haven't looked for it, but I think the tolerance to shade systems is a whole research here that needs to be developed. But I think it's encouraging what's coming out of that. The fact that plants, and there's a huge range of grass species. David talked about mixed species swards, and that really, I think, is the way ahead for getting much more nutritive pastures that will root deeper, that will be more light tolerant, and will give that ecological diversity that makes grass swards much more resilient than just simply perennial ryegrass or something.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Jim. I think that's a full answer to that. John Geraghty, if we can move on to you, John. You know, I was fascinated by your kind of ratio that you outlined there, the 3% versus the 30% in terms of the funding available for agriculture in relation to global warming and to climate change. What's the case that can be made there? How do we get a better sort of a grab of that funding, and how do we make the case to get back to what David O'Connell talked about in relation to that holy grail idea of climate change and farm efficiency and viability going hand in hand?
Well, it's not easy because you have to look at the origins of the Common Agricultural Policy. I mean, it was actually designed to rehabilitate Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War. And the challenge then was to actually produce food, because we were receiving food aid from the United States under the Marshall Plan. The Common Agricultural Policy was nearly a victim of its own success, because where we had deficits in food, we actually ended up with food surpluses and grain mountains and wine lakes and butter mountains in the 90s. And it was administratively very costly to keep it running. So the main reform happened under Ray McSharry. So And that was the initiation of changes with the Common Agricultural Policy. But if you look at what has actually happened over the last number of years, what they've done is they've held on to the whole principles and the objectives of realizing food security and production and guaranteeing viable livelihoods in rural areas, but they've added on other requirements to it, like, for example, biodiversity enhancement, environmental sensitivity in terms of production methods, climate change mitigation and adaptation. And unfortunately, the problem is, I was at a conference for the last 3 days, a European health conference for the last 3 days. One of the issues is that some of the objectives that are actually laid out in the Common Agricultural Policy and now the European Green Deal and also the Farm to Fork strategy are actually contradictory. And this is a major problem. And the other thing is, we're in a situation now where, on average, the dependency on transfer payments from the Common Agricultural Policy, on average across all farms in Ireland, is in the region of between 70 and 75%. So, unfortunately, David alluded to this when he was speaking, and it's really important. We have associated reduction in emissions in a negative context in the agriculture sector, right? It's kind of a sacrifice that we must make, all right? And unfortunately, a lot of that narrative has been brought to bear by, we'll say, different organizations, even at government level as well in the public sector. But the thing about it is, reduction in emissions are inefficiencies. They're actually a loss of money. They're a loss of energy in any production system. So if we want to become more efficient, we actually do need to reduce emissions. And, you know, I mean, the good thing about today, I think, is, and the positive thing I'd like farmers to take from it, is that we can actually make our production systems, whatever they are, right? And it could be thoroughbred production as well. We can make them more efficient, reduce costs, reduce inputs, and thereby improve profitability. And we can still facilitate, you know, all of these demands with relation to improving environmental profile, managing and regulating water, managing and regulating biodiversity. Now, the interesting thing, I mentioned that conference over in Europe during the week, just as an aside, the amount of money that's coming from the private sector now in the United States for voluntary markets, not just for carbon, okay, not just for carbon, but also for water management and biodiversity, is really, they actually can't administratively in the States, they cannot keep abreast of it. And it hasn't really arrived to any major extent in Europe yet. So even if governments don't, and the European Union doesn't actually take the lead on this, I think we will see the private sector actually demanding, in terms of their efforts to improve the company profiles in terms of corporate social responsibility. I actually think that they are going to start, you know, putting in place measures whereby they will support farmers who are engaged in climate-friendly practices, water management-friendly practices, and biodiversity-friendly practices. So I think John Sweeney made a very important point there. You actually have a very positive story. Thoroughbred breeders have a very positive story, and you need to bring that to the table. All right, you actually just need to enhance what it is you're doing and improve what it is you're doing. But I think you'll make a very, very positive contribution to reducing overall emissions in the Irish context. You're already doing so, but we're not actually getting the due credit for doing that. And I think that's possibly the way forward for us, you know.
I think that, thanks, John. I think that's fundamentally it, isn't it? That's the next step for us now, is to start building up that recognition and to start building up that measurement and to start actually gaining credit for it and to be able to draw down incentives wherever they may come from, whether it's from Europe or from our own department or whether it's from private enterprise. Thanks, John. And I suppose just to finish off the Q&A with David, who gave us such an excellent micro level analysis there, I suppose, on farms and the management of soil, the management of our nutrients, the management of our minerals. If we could just ask a couple of maybe more specific questions around fertilizer and grass quality, and how do we go about reducing the amount of fertilizer whilst maintaining the nutritional ability of the soil? What are the sort of simple measures that we can take home from today and start putting into practice on our farms?
Just before I answer that, Carl, I want to make one quick point. Just in terms of climate change mitigation, I think we need to make it a habit in our daily lives. I was on a farm there, and I think it was John Sweeney who mentioned about electric vehicles. But we were myself and Megan were on a farm there recently, and the owner cycled up to us on his bike, and that's how he gets around the stud farm. He doesn't drive around in a quad or a Jeep or whatever. And so there's a benefit from the point of view of he's burning less carbon. It's only a small thing, but it's a habit in his daily routine. And obviously then from a personal fitness point of view, he's better off. So there's a lot of simple little things like that we can do on a daily basis. And if we start off with one simple little thing, it just becomes a habit in our daily lives. And we're sort of subconsciously getting better. Just to make that point. With regard to fertilizer, I think in a lot of instances, what we've been doing is that people, number one is they're very subject to salespeople coming out and saying that their product is better than the next guy's. And then they get into a habit of routinely putting out the same level of fertilizer at the same time every year. So I think the first step is to actually basically analyze your soils and see what the requirement is there for it. One of the key components, and it is a little bit of a double whammy, in that if you are applying lime to land, there is a carbon cost to it. But by balancing your pH and your calcium levels in your soil, you make the function of all the other minerals much more efficient. And very often with regard to lime, there's a critical balance in terms of having enough and having too much, and maybe triggering another problem in terms of a copper or a zinc deficiency on a farm. So to my mind, the first step is just to take a step back, analyze what nutrients you're using on the farm, and then deciding if they're required, and then if they are required, that they're put out in a sort of a targeted fashion and at levels that are basically going to help improve your crop performance. And very often, say farmers say phosphorus, it's an expensive nutrient. It's about, I don't know, €3.40 or €3.50 a kilo, as opposed to chemical nitrogen, which is 40 or 50 cents. So it's a very expensive nutrient. We don't actually need that much of it. And most of the grasses that we analyze, when you look at the phosphorus content in terms of your calcium phosphorus ratio for bone development, in most cases, it's there or thereabouts. So we actually don't need vast amounts of phosphorus. But what we might need is a relatively small amount at a key time to get our roots going, because it's very important in terms of root development. And once we put out a small bit of phosphorus at the right time to kick off our roots and get them functioning properly, well, then our root to soil contact is much more improved, and the root's ability to access all the other essential nutrients in the soil is much more efficient. So, that's where I would start. Just take a step back, quantify what we're using, and then assess it in terms of the absolute requirement to help us produce a better racehorse, and look at the efficiencies of that. And it's amazing, very small adjustments can make a huge difference. You're on mute, Carl.
I got away with that for the entire way without it had to be done. Just one final question that's just come in at the end there from John Tuttle around solar panels on stable roofs, and we noticed that there was a change in the I think in the planning permission laws during the week there from government. Just very briefly, your thoughts on that, and then we'll wrap things up. I think we've dealt with all the questions and comments now.
Sorry, I missed that, Carl.
Sorry, John. Sorry, David. Just a final question has just come in there, and we'll wrap it up after that. Just from John Tuttle around solar panels on stable roofs, and the government have just brought in a new change to the planning laws on solar panels. What are your take on that? It's slightly from left field from what you've been talking about, but if you're happy to take it.
Well, yeah, we've actually done it. We've put in solar panels, and I'd have to say now, well, not largely, basically 100% on pushing from my wife. But we've installed solar panels, and we bought an electric vehicle. We bought a Hyundai, and it's been a real learning curve, you know, in terms of what can be done. And there's you can download. There's a data generated in terms of battery storage, and I would say for the month of June that car has more or less been run from the power generated from the PV panels. So it definitely has to be considered. I think probably the ascent, you know, if you were to be really strict in terms of analyzing the cost benefit in terms of your capital outlay, you know, the payback, it's probably greater than 7 years. You know, I think that needs to be analyzed in a bit more detail, and maybe incentivized, you know, a bit better from a government point of view. Having said that, we don't know what's going to happen in terms of energy security going forward, and what's going to happen in terms of energy pricing. So in actual fact, that payback period in terms of your initial capital investment could drop quite dramatically over the next while, depending on electricity prices. The other interesting thing is, when you purchase an EV vehicle, you can't just sit in the car and drive to Galway and not think about how you're going to refuel. Now, having said that, the car it does over 400 kilometers, but you do start to think about your journey and the fuel component and the energy component of that. And again, it's a bit like, you know, our client who was cycling the bike. It starts to become a little bit in terms of your day-to-day planning, and you know, it's much more to the forefront of your thought process. But like there's absolutely tons of stuff. We actually have another client who is looking at replacing. They have what do you call them, the gators. They've 2 or 3 of them on the farm, and they're actually going to delay the purchase of them now because there's electric gators coming out very shortly, and they're going to instigate that along with the increased installation of PV panels. You know, so there are certainly people out there thinking about it, and you know, I think it can only be a good thing, and it has to be encouraged.
So, suffice to say then, I think, David, you know, the opportunities are endless. The opportunities are endless in so many different areas on this entire topic. So look, guys, we'll wrap it up there. I think it's fair to say there's a depth of work to do, and the ITBA is, you know, fully committed to getting the industry on the front foot. And that begins today. I want to thank everyone for their participation, the excellent engagement throughout the webinar, and just a huge thank you as always to Shane, to Kerry, and the entire ITBA team for pulling everything together. And as David said, Kerry really is an expert in the behind the scenes and drawing it all together, and does a huge amount of work there to make sure everything ran so smoothly. I'd like to thank Minister Hackett for her time and support for our industry as we go forward. And last but not least, just a huge thanks to the excellent panel of speakers today. I personally, and I think everyone would agree, I found it absolutely fascinating, and just, you know, there's so much scope to this. So our huge thanks to Professor John Sweeney, Professor Jim McAdam, John Geraghty, and to David O'Connell, who have delivered so much food for thought for us all. So look, that concludes today's webinar. Wish everybody back the winner of the Irish Derby, hopefully on Saturday, and have a good weekend. And we'll be back in touch again with next steps as to where we go from here. So thanks everybody. Enjoy your lunch, enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you again real soon. Take care.